Not all of my adventures and investigations involve dangerous journeys to far-off places. Sometimes they involve dangerous journeys to very nearby places, and I count the Feywild very much in that category. I have endeavoured, over the years, to learn about the place, but its innate properties make this an exercise in futility. First off, I'm one of those people who just tends to forget ever being there when I do return. Although I do have strange dreams for months afterwards, and my writing, when I stray into the more imaginative parts, take on a little more whimsy and oddity than usual for quite some time. I'll find myself wanting to compose songs about my favourite foods. I'll get into rather long conversations about floristry for no particular reason, and my few elven friends will most certainly notice and politely point out that my emotions tend to be a little closer to the surface than usual. The really frustrating thing is that when a visit to the Fey realm occurs suddenly and unexpectedly, well, I wake up somewhere, sometime later, with a note in my pocket that says, I am in the Feywild, and in this notable case, I wake up with a large entry in my travel journal on something wondrous I encountered there, with no recollection of having written and illustrated it. Few have any idea how strange it is to see your own writing, your own voice and imagination there on the pages. Well, you can imagine, I'm sure. It's very weird. So, I have a journal full of information, quite detailed and thorough information on the Faerie dragons, and I don't remember writing a word of it. But what is worse, I included a number of stoppered and numbered vials that contained some substance that sounded a bit like a liquid, and I had to read carefully through the journal before, on one page, in the margins, I found a small table listing what those vials and numbers were. And after trying out the contents of just one of them, I still have all the rest, stoppered and safely, securely stored away in a secret place which is unknown to me, because I asked my pseudo-dragon friend Macrotaxel to take the box containing them away and never let me know where they are. That box will be delivered to a suitable institution in Waterdeep into the hands of a researcher whom I have great trust in on the event of my untimely demise. Each of those vials contains a sample of the breath weapon of a Faerie dragon, magically preserved, and each is from a different colour of Faerie dragon, so it's a complete collection. I am told this is very rare and fairly valuable. Left in my own clutches, though, they would have been gone within a week. Today, I will be sharing some of that journal with you and explaining exactly why I can't be trusted around Faerie dragon breath. As we all seem to have reflections of ourselves living in other parallel dimensions, not all of them, sure, but more than enough to make it seem like a never-ending amount of versions of ourselves, there exists in the Feywild a reflection, and I guess a relative, a cousin of the pseudo-dragon species. These are the Faerie dragons, about as large as house cats and quite lovely to behold, with that same mischievous nature of the pseudo-dragon magnified quite a lot. Legends tell that they were a species created from the stuff of the Feywild itself, by a primal Fey entity, none other than Rhiannon, Celtic moon goddess, born of the first moonrise, the divine queen of the fairies, who rides a brilliant white horse and is dressed in glittering gold and constantly surrounded by mystical singing birds. This may be a bit confusing, but it pays to remember that the Feywild borders both the material and the divine realms. Rhiannon is a divine queen of the Fae, while Titania is a non-divine queen, or at least the origin of Titania was of the material plane, while the origin of Rhiannon is the divine realms. I'm no expert in ancient Fey history, but it seems that the stories, legends, and mythologies of the peoples of the material plane have shaped the Feywild kind of in waves. So there are domains of the Feywild that were once thriving, bustling courts of divine activity, which are now returned to the savage nature on steroids, with very primal wilderness swallowing up lost or forgotten Fey realms now fallen to ruin. Forgotten. Their stories now lost, and the things that were once marvels now picked over by evil hags and Fomorian giants for components in their own foul creations. Rhiannon was, or is, the queen of the little folk, considered by Fey tradition to be the mother of the many different Fey races, while Titania, powerful as she is merely queen of the Seelie court, the summer queen, and she is also a queen of light. So she is highly impressive to behold. Her skin is the colour of honey, and her hair shimmers with all the colours of autumn leaves, with eyes that glow like sunlight. Titania is one of the leaders of all summer Eladrin, and a brilliant strategist both in court and on the battlefield, with a dry sense of humour and quite a pragmatic way of handling things, all things considered. She's a very powerful archfey though, so merely being in her presence can be extremely hazardous to mortal beings of the prime material plane, and she has the innate power to instill an implacable aversion to the Feywild in any creature that she decides to ban from there, preventing them from ever returning to the Feywild, All of the fairy dragons found in the many worlds of the prime material plane are there because they were accompanying a powerful archfey through some portal between the realms along with a group of fairies. And they just got overly curious and wandered off, eventually getting left behind to their own devices. They can travel through portals by themselves, of course, but they seldom choose to without some fairly immediate reason. The following, I must warn you, is going to conflict a fair bit with the latest information presented in Fizban's Treasury of Dragons. If you own or have access to that book, have fun comparing the two. Also, I have no idea where they got the pronunciation of the Fey Powers names from. As far as I can tell, they're using Irish names for Welsh mythology. I have to admit, it's a hornet's nest, and I simply don't wish to kick it very hard. So, you can decide for yourselves. I will say that there is absolutely no mention, as far as I can tell, of transdimensional dragon sight in any lore found before 5th edition, and it seems to be wedged into the lore for the same reason elves suddenly gained the power to remember past lives. A personal agenda that imposed itself without any feedback from the actual player base of the hobby, and it seems to be about as welcome as a fart in an elevator, but time will tell. There is a direct conflict with the lore about fairy dragons and their interest in treasure, for instance, so feel completely free to ignore that stuff in Fizban's if you would rather avoid your players targeting poor little fairy dragons for murder and looting. They may have some gems, sure, but they're just as likely to collect pretty bits of coloured glass or semi-precious stones from a riverbed, or a collection of pretty bird feathers and a hoard of old pie crusts. Also, there's no fucking way a fairy dragon would ever wear the gilded skull of a pseudo-dragon. It's just ridiculous. It's their cousin. Wearing a skull and playing pretend is fine, don't get me wrong, but not a pseudo-dragon skull, and I'll explain why in a moment. There may be instances where fairy dragons have an object in their lair which they are keeping as a gift for a leprechaun or a sprite or a friend of theirs, in which case, yes, they may have a bag of gold coins or some such, or a bottle of fine wine for a leprechaun for sure. But usually no, they are not well known for keeping precious coins, jewels, art objects, or magic items. Lucky for me, I am good friends with a pseudo-dragon who read the text of my mysterious journal with great interest and provided a ton of additional information, which was all news to me. For instance, I had no idea Macrotaxel and the rest of the pseudo-dragons and fairy dragons had their own patron deity, or folk hero. Nair takes the form of a fairy dragon about 2 feet long, agile and thin, with gossamer butterfly-like wings and a prehensile tail, his little head permanently expressing a mischievous grin. He is a member of the Seelie court and is revered by all pseudo-dragons, fairy dragons, and also various chaotic good-aligned sprites, grigs, and pixies. Although he is not really that interested in court politics outside of his own intermediary divine influence over the portfolios of mischief and pranks, still he is fairly powerful. So Titania and Eberron have little choice but to tolerate his presence in the outer circle of the ever-mobile Seelie court. Technically, he's also a member of the pantheon of draconic deities, and can come and go from their stomping grounds as he pleases, since none would ever consider him any sort of threat. As you would expect, his is the archetype of the pseudo-dragon, and particularly the fairy dragon personality. Playful, frivolous, and flippant to an almost infuriating degree, only as engaged with the situation as much as it intersects with his current prank, and his constant shenanigans are barely tolerated by the rest of the Seelie court, and yet he is really quite a haughty and arrogant being, a true dragon. However, he is a master of diffusing conflict with jokes and pranks, even at his own expense. He is infamous for casting illusions to make the buttocks of humanoids radiate bright red light and emit distinctly musical toots. Also, keep in mind that he is a very powerful master of divine and illusionary magic, with the equivalent powers of a level 19 illusionist and a level 17 cleric in his avatar form. So if you attempt to raise a weapon against him, any number of the Seelie courts, his worshippers, or really any fey creature in his presence, he's most likely going to suddenly polymorph that weapon into a stuffed toy animal in your hands, or some other sort of toy of a much more intimate type, if you get my drift. His intention is to neutralize not only the weapon, but the intent and confidence to use it. He's very likely to grant magical inspiration to Fey who ask him for more mastery of magic, and he grants spells to his worshippers from his divine portfolios. So, clerics and priests of Nair are also quite skilled in illusions and charms, influencing animals, causing random chaotic effects, and manipulating elemental energies, the weather, and the growth of plants. His avatar is most commonly found on Toril in the island of Evermeet, far out on the trackless sea beyond the Sword Coast. His holy symbol takes the form of a big smile, and he is rarely worshipped by humanoids outside of the elven race. The perfect offering to him is nothing less than a freshly baked apple pie made with honey and white raisins, which is his absolute favourite. Within the Seelie court, usually he hangs out with the official court jester named Seelie, the leprechaun demigod of trickery and illusions. Their names are of Welsh origin, of course, which has a close similarity to the Wayland language spoken by the folk of the Moonshae Isles and the Five Kingdoms, which border Faerun, Karatur and Zakara. Translated to common, Naeskayak and Skelly mean the winged serpent and the storyteller, but never call them that when directly addressing them in the Fae court, as it's considered quite rude to do so unless they give you permission to translate their name to another language first. But I suggest if you're not comfortable pronouncing Welsh words, then stick with the common. While the winged serpent is not welcome in the inner circle of the Seelie court, the storyteller is welcome. So a lot of their pranks originate with the serpent and end with the storyteller getting in a lot of trouble that he has to talk his way out of quickly. So already we have a pretty good insight into the personality of the fairy dragons. They are pranksters. They are unpredictable in many things, but they're very predictable in other very specific things, such as their absolute adoration of fresh, hot-baked and very sweet apple pies and other delicious treats. To them, such things are better than gold and jewels. They are known to go to extreme lengths to attain such indulgent snacks and can be easily bribed with them. Fairy dragons do not eat meat. They enjoy nectar, fruits of all kinds, and share a similar sort of ecological niche as a hummingbird. Oh, they do eat bugs. Flying bugs mostly, so they're a bit of an insectivore and a bit of a herbivore. They do need to eat butterflies on a fairly regular basis, otherwise it can dull the spectacular patterns and colours of their wings. Like all true dragons, fairy dragons only grow stronger with age, and they transition through quite distinct stages of maturity. In their case, it's much more obvious which stage of life they've attained by the colour of their scales. As hatchlings, they're tiny and usually a deep ruby red. This red quickly becomes suffused with an iridescent reflection of all the colours of the rainbow, but red will continue to be the main colour reflected by the scales, until they reach their next age category, where this dominant colour will shift into orange, and then yellow, green, blue, indigo, and finally pure violet. According to the Chapter 1 of the novel Tamora's Luck, they lay their eggs in tiny, closely nestled clusters with a nest of all sorts of materials they find on the forest floor. They tend to have a higher birth rate than other dragons, but then they don't live as long as their larger cousins on the prime material plane. It only takes 50 years on average for a fairy dragon to become that lovely violet colour. They can stay this way for many more decades, simply gaining more mastery of magic, before eventually they'll enter a short period of weakness and decline called twilight before they die. According to the earlier edition Draconomicon, in the teachings of some draconic religions of Faerun, the dragon's soul, which they call the anima, did not immediately depart the final resting place of the body, but was bound to it until it was completely decayed. Yet another reason why fairy dragons won't wear pseudo-dragon skulls. And only then was it free to wander on its way. The ultimate destination of the dragon anima is something of a mystery to scholars, I'm sorry to say. Some travel to the astral plane, others wander the prime material plane, simply investigating it all, but no longer able to interact with it. In the Feywild, it's much less certain how long it will take for a fairy dragon to reach its twilight, or how long a fairy dragon can ultimately live. In some cases, it may be hundreds or even thousands of years old. It really depends on how closely bound to a particular Fey domain they are and what the properties of that domain are. The anima may even be reincarnated within that domain. As I said, it's a mystery. A fully mature fairy dragon has an armor class of 15, 4d4 plus 4, or between 8 and 20 with an average of 14 hit points. They are tiny and therefore quite limited in the distance they can cover on foot with a speed of only 10 feet per round, but very agile in flight with a speed of 60 feet, and so they tend to hover or dart about in the air, perching on hard to reach spots, and they almost always create a lair for themselves within the crook of a branch where it meets the trunk of a well-established tree, if possible. They are fond of basking in the bright sunshine, so much more pleasant than the permanent twilight of the Feywild. They are not built for brawling. Their strength is only 3, however they have a dexterity of 20 and are tougher than they look with a constitution of 13. They have 60-foot dark vision and a passive perception of 13. However, they are quick-witted and their irrepressible curiosity makes them pay a lot of attention to their surroundings. They have an intelligence of 14, a charisma of 16, and a wisdom of 12. Plus, they have a +3 to active perception checks, +7 to stealth checks, and +4 to their arcana skill checks. In 5th edition D&D, some of their abilities from previous editions have been dramatically adjusted. For example, they can communicate with other fairy dragons telepathically. In older editions, the range for this was 2 miles. and now it's only 60 feet. And I'm not entirely sure why such a severe limitation was put on this ability, since it's such a specific form of telepathy that only works between fairy dragons, and it's a tool for the Dungeon Master to use mainly. But there it is. I'll let you decide if it fits your needs one way or the other. And there have been a couple of other changes. The fairy dragons of 5th edition have magical resistance, and their innate spell casting ability is something I think is going to get a significant update if they are going to be included in Mordenkainen's Monsters of the Multiverse. We shall return to the spell knowledge in a moment. First, I want to talk about the fairy dragon's infamous breath weapon. It's Euphoria gas. First, the difficulty class of the saving throw remains 11, regardless of the age category of the fairy dragon from which it came. And I think that can be adjusted. So DC 11 for red, yellow, and green fairy dragons, DC 12 for blue and indigo, and DC 13 for violet fairy dragons. Simple enough. Second, since the effect of the gas is, in and of itself, entirely harmless, giving a creature an automatic saving throw against the effect at the end of its turn, which then ends the effect, is far too weighted in the player character's favour. But we need to take a closer look at what the text of this effect actually says. The breath weapon can be exhaled by the fairy dragon potentially an unlimited amount of times per day, but to be used in combat, the DM must roll a 6-sided die for the dragon, and the breath weapon recharges for that round on a result of 5 or 6. This is done every single round, and breathing the gas takes up all the actions for that round aside from movement and any bonus action it may have, so it can't cast a spell and use the breath, or attack with a bite and use the breath, or bite and cast a spell. So the takeaway from this is that really fairy dragons absolutely need to be paired up with a group of allies in order to really stand any sort of chance in combat. And they rely a lot on their superior invisibility. You see, fairy dragons can remain invisible even after they attack another creature, as long as they don't cast any spells that require concentration, or their concentration is not broken some other way, and they will always try to remain invisible in any sort of threatening situation. The range of the breath weapon is only 5 feet. In other words, it's immediately adjacent to where the fairy dragon is. However, as a tiny creature who can fly, and putting aside the rules as written to think about the actual logistics for a moment, I see nothing wrong with a tiny, invisible flying creature fluttering above another creature's head, occupying the same 5-foot space, technically, and breathing a 2-foot wide cloud of gas into that or adjacent 5-foot spaces. It really isn't that big of a deal. As for the effect, there's no mention of the target needing to be a creature that breathes in order to be affected. So this toxin is some sort of a magical contact poison. It can be breathed, ingested, or merely make contact with exposed skin. There's also no mention, but it can be assumed that the gas cloud dissipates quickly and the concentration of it becomes so attenuated that it's no longer effective. However, there is plenty of evidence in the lore across many published sources that the little dragons can use repeated exhalations of the gas to slowly flood an enclosed, fairly small room with it to a concentration that will most certainly be very effective. The psychotropic effect of the narcotic is to release massive amounts of endorphins that last for 60 seconds, 1 full minute. This immediately causes extreme emotions to abate and induces a euphoric feeling that may be associated with mild hallucinations, but most often causes a sense of wonder, a fixated fascination with random things immediately present in the area. Someone under the influence of the gas may become totally absorbed by the feeling and ignore everything going on around them, simply wandering in a random direction at its normal rate of speed, or they may become immobile, usually because they've just stopped in their tracks by the most beautiful, amazing flower, or the melodic buzz of a passing insect, or they may become fascinated by the clasp on their belt, or the taste of their own tongue. They may simply stand there in the middle of combat, a busy marketplace, or relaxed on some cushions in a drug den, perplexed and enraptured by the idea that they have fingernails, or that the sky still has stars in it during the day, but you can't see them. The tricky part of the text in 5th edition is what it doesn't say. So if you flip to page 37 of the monster manual and compare the paralytic poison of the carrion crawler's tentacles, for that it specifically says that the target can repeat the saving throw at the end of each of its turns, ending the poison condition on itself on a success. The fairy dragon's euphoric breath effect does not allow a saving throw at the end of the target's turns to end the narcotic's effect. The target who fails that initial saving throw is under the influence of it for the full minute, unless a potion or some other magical effect ends the condition for them. I'm just fine with that. The initial saving throw is not that hard to make, and the effect is not that harmful. It's just that other factors may put that euphoric victim in considerable danger in the middle of combat, or in a very hostile situation, or in a very nasty environment. A target under the influence is not going to wander blindly into molten lava or walk off a cliff. That's not the intent of the effect. They're just blissed out, really, really stoned. They might do something quite ill-advised, like point at an ogre and giggle, which is going to start a fight for absolute sure, but play the situation as it lays. Be creative and play the situation for how funny it can be, and that goes for players as well. Under the influence, during that 60 seconds of bliss, the target rolls a 6-sided die at the start of their turn. On a result of 1 to 4, they take no actions or bonus actions and simply move at their normal movement speed in a random direction. On a result of 5 or 6, they don't move. Instead, they stand where they are, utterly overcome by the feeling, and will remain frozen like that each round until they make another wisdom saving throw and end the stupor on that success. The difficulty of the save is not high, but chances are the victim is not going to be doing much except leaving the immediate area or standing still for long enough for the fairy dragon to beat a hasty retreat or perhaps play a prank on the victim before they make an escape. See, fairy dragons are not aggressive creatures. They avoid combat and keep their distance if they can, remaining invisible unless they are with those they can trust or they think they're in a safe environment. Their bite attack only does 1 point of damage, but they are +7 to hit, and that bonus gives some idea as to how agile they can be, and they're quite capable of doing some very sneaky things. I am kind of stunned that there is no mention at all in 5th edition that fairy dragons have got long, fully prehensile tails. This means that they can pick up and fly with a loaded hand crossbow and actually aim and fire the thing while in flight. And they can most likely dose that bolt with their euphoric toxin, something the player characters were probably not expecting. They can make use of any weapon their tiny fey friends might carry with them. So darts, light but magically enchanted spiderweb nets that can engulf a person's head and stick like glue, blowguns, dropped bags of marbles, even making use of magic wands. That prehensile tail can be used for all sorts of things, including flying rapidly past a person and snatching a glazed donut right out of their hand. I may seem a little bit harsh in my comments of Fizban's Treasury of Dragons, but it does actually provide a great expansion to the lore of the fairy dragon. So let's take a look at the lair and regional effects listed there. And I'll quote here, "Fairy dragons go where the fun is. For many, this means dwelling near portals to the Feywild, enjoying that realm's unpredictable magic and boisterous revels. Yet, it can easily mean residing among other peoples, stealing baubles from shrines, nesting in cluttered attics, or following explorers and other intriguing individuals on their travels. For as much as they love their homes and hoards, fairy dragons abandon both without a second thought if adventure beckons." This tracks pretty closely with what Macrotaxel and the pseudo-dragon kinfolk get up to as well, so they're very similar in many respects. Fairy dragon lairs are as varied and eccentric as their owners. Some resemble simple animal nests hidden away in secret crevices or woven of twigs and trash in the forks of ancient trees. Fairy dragons may also draw on the trappings of civilization, perhaps stealing a child's dollhouse for use as a manor, or convincing pixies to construct them a silken bower. The most elaborate fairy dragon lairs are modelled off those of larger dragons, featuring multiple chambers and cunning traps. And remember, these traps will never be intended to cause serious injury, so think of the classic concealed spring-loaded net that scoops interlopers up and suspends them in the air. Also, magical wards that temporarily reduce a trespasser's size for a while are excellent, and there is a good example of dealing with a fairy dragon or pseudo-dragon for that matter, while the size difference has been negated, with either the dragon enlarging or the player characters reducing in size, or both. I'll get to that in a minute. An example of the more complex fairy dragon lairs, we find one that is built around several hollowed out chambers inside a large dead tree. The tree is decorated with the dragon's lesser treasures, its limbs draped with scrolls and scarves and set with glittering glass. You can certainly locate this within the lair of a much larger good-aligned dragon, or close to it anyway, and it's quite likely in cases like this that many fairy dragons will be sharing this complex lair along with a troop of other tiny fey folk who are all fickle but staunch allies of the dragons, in the way of the Fae. A typical lair has the following features. First, a trapped entrance. Just inside the knothole that acts as the lair's main entrance, the dragon has hidden a stolen hunting trap. It's not going to be a massive bear trap. A snare is a pretty good option. Elven snares made of woven flax that constricts and tightens the knots of the cord the more the prey struggles, but it's not too hard to cut through with a blade unless it's also enchanted cord. Next, the entrance passage opens up into an audience chamber where the dragon lounges on a pillow and entertains diminutive fey guests, or in lieu of fey, perhaps a family of very confused squirrels. I love that idea. A porcupine could prove to be tricky to deal with, but an Oram Vorax or a dire weasel can be pretty damn dangerous. They could be charmed and very placid with the fairy dragon, but highly aggressive to any non-fey who show up suddenly. There will also be a chamber devoted to the dragon's collection of treasures, whatever this may be. This will almost always include a stash of baked goods of exceptional tastiness, and it's a great way to sneak some enchanted fairy foods on your greedy player characters. There will also be the sleeping chamber, carefully decorated and lined with bits of mirrored glass, perhaps a collection of silk fabrics stuffed into a brilliantly polished knight's great helm. This is a good place to hide a fairly impressive gemstone or a small stuffed animal toy. They will hold pretty much the same emotional value to the dragon. Finally, there will always be an escape tunnel, well concealed at both ends, hard to access from outside the lair, in the middle of a tangle of thorns or some such. Fizban provides some optional lair actions for fairy dragons of green colour or older. Grasping roots and vines that are under the control of the dragon seem to be a reference to older lore where fairy dragons are able to select their known spells from both arcane and druid spell lists. The fairy dragon may also create a chaotic aura, misdirecting the currents of air and magic around itself. So whenever a ranged attack roll misses the dragon, re-roll the attack against a random creature within 30 feet of the dragon that doesn't have total cover against the attack. This one could be quite nasty if the player character party happens to include a cranked up arcane archer. Looking at you, my lovely power gamers. Then of course we have the regional effects caused by the sustained presence and supernatural influence of the Fey and elemental dragons, which gives the wider environment specific telltale traits. One is that of the compulsory offering, where the first time a creature comes within 1 mile of the fairy dragon's lair, the creature must succeed on a DC 15 wisdom saving throw or feel an overwhelming compulsion to leave an offering worth at least 5 gold coins stashed in an out-of-the-way place. The dragon immediately senses the location of this gift. I'd also say that if the player character just happens to be carrying any delicious snacks, baked goods and apple pies, they would leave those instead. Also, within 1 mile of the lair, time itself can become more fluid, flowing somewhere between half and twice its normal speed. This is, from a world-building perspective, a super potent effect that has very wide-ranging impacts, potentially on the region. How handy would it be for an artificer or a school of study, an order of contemplative monks, a cheese-making workshop, a warehouse full of booze that is aging and maturing at a supernatural rate? It's mind-blowing how much fun you could have with this if you really ponder all the implications. Finally, sapient creatures that spend no less than a year within 5 miles of the dragon's lair will feel a persistent urge to play pranks on others. If their lair happens to be located by a township that has been under the influence of this effect, again, world-building implications are solid gold there. Let your imagination go wild with the possibilities. If the fairy dragon dies, these effects fade over the course of 1 to 10 days. But remember that such a region may well include lots of fairy dragons, and also it might be the influence of a Feywild portal that the fairy dragons are nesting close to, not actually the dragons themselves causing all these supernatural effects. From my own experience, I've had games where villains were exploiting fairy dragons that had been captured and forced to produce Euphoria gas, to the point where the efforts had made them quite ill, and they are fed a terrible diet which leaves them dull, sickly, and prone to whining pitiably. It takes one particularly stone-hearted adventurer to ignore the plight of such lovely little creatures, but some will overlook this abuse if it means a ready supply of narcotics. The most terrible thing is, the dragons can actually be persuaded to produce the gas for others if they are simply provided with a steady supply of fresh hot apple pies and a nice comfortable place to rest and socialise with each other. They are quick-witted and happy, and they're not hard to please, and like all dragons, they have an inherently vain and avaricious, greedy nature that leaves them vulnerable to flattery and bribery. They are also innately good. They are loyal friends and will not stand by and let others, innocent creatures, suffer, even putting themselves at some risk to rescue those who are being bullied, attacked, or held captive against their will. They can also set up and carry out elaborate pranks that humiliate, torment, and teach somewhat hard lessons to those who have harmed their friends. The vengeance of a fairy dragon may be hilarious, but it's not going to be fun for the target. Just try cleaning tar and feathers off yourself without the aid of magic, I dare you. A typical prank of a fairy dragon in the wild is to cast an illusion over a beehive, making it look like a treasure chest or something. And when someone has meddled with the thing due to their own greed, the fairy dragon will move in and make off with a nice meal of honeycomb. The pesky bee is drawn off to swarm and sting the poor sucker who fell for the illusion hook, line and sinker. Never underestimate simple illusions. A fairy dragon that spots a missing step on an old staircase will rarely be able to resist casting an illusion that shows the missing step being present and perfectly functional. If there's something messy for the victim to tumble into at the bottom of those stairs, all the better. An illusion of the doorknob being on the left rather than the right side of a door is also hilarious. Looking at the spell selections, I'd say any illusion spells are fair game. Avoid evocation and such. Violent spells are avoided by fairy dragons. The powers and channels through which they learn these magics just don't make the knowledge available to them anyway. One spell they are well known for is Legend Lore, and also Polymorph Object. Patient and polite treatment of a fairy dragon can provide a source of amazing information for the adventurers that can be the key to furthering their quests. It's your job as the dungeon master to make the players aware that the fairy dragons can magically gather information for them. So drop those hints, provide examples, or at least provide a non-player character who lets the player characters know about this aspect of their lore. Oh yeah, size alterations. In the adventure titled Waterdeep Dungeon of the Mad Mage, the fairy dragon Otto is of normal size, but the player characters are miniaturized so that the dragon appears to be 12 feet long relative to its surroundings. This is much larger than an enlarged spell could accomplish, as that would only transform the tiny dragon to a small dragon. But there's no reason why a ward accomplishing the enchantment could not be more radical than the arcane spell. Or perhaps the player characters are reduced from medium to small size and the dragon is enlarged from tiny to small size, so they're dealing with each other on a more level playing field. As mentioned, even so, the dragon is unlikely to engage in physical combat, but in the example of 12-foot-long large-size Otto, he has 104 hit points, a strength of 18, and a bite attack that inflicts 2d6 plus 4 piercing damage. Fairy dragons have actually got quite long, thin, and yet very strong fangs, and a jaw that has a notable upward curve from a joint very far back on the skull, so they can open their mouth very wide. This just happens to make it look like they are grinning all the time. Okay. So, I suggest, if you're making the euphoric breath a key feature of your adventure, add some unique traits to the breath of each of the different colours of the fairy dragon, which brings me back, at last, full circle, to that collection of vials I had Macrotaxel take away and hide from me. In the margins of the page next to the numbers I wrote on the stoppers on those vials, it named a colour and one word describing the effect of the Euphoria. Which brings me back at last, full circle, to that collection of vials I had Macrotaxel take away and hide from me. In the margins of the page next to each of the numbers I wrote on the stoppers in those vials, it named a colour and one word to describe the effect of the Euphoria. Number 1 was red, and the word was giggles. Number 2 was orange, and the word was contentment. Number 3 was yellow, and the word was satisfaction. Number 4 was green, and the word was excitement. Number 5 was blue, and the word was wonderment. Number 6 was indigo, and the word was discovery. And finally, number 7 was violet, and the word was epiphany. I can tell you, my friends, the word epiphany was what caused me to beg my pseudo-dragon friend to take those vials far away from me. No sage can possibly resist the ecstasy of a sudden and intuitive realization, the joy of that total clarity, and new vistas of hitherto impossible questions based on a new understanding. It was all I could do to stop myself from breaking the seal on that vial right then and there. Thankfully, I didn't. As great as it would have felt, I am certain the crash after that high would have been quite depressing. Narcotics have a tendency to destroy your own natural ability to feel the way the drug artificially makes you feel in the long term, and the thought of losing the ability to experience a true epiphany is too horrible to contemplate. My name is AJ Pickett, professional YouTube sage and scholar of tabletop RPG lore. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll be back with more for you very soon.